Hello, everyone. My name is Morgane Oger. I'm the director and founder of the Morgane Oger Foundation. We're a Canadian nonprofit society working to narrow the gap between the law and the experience lived on the ground by people facing marginalization and oppression. We primarily operate in Canada, but we're also active internationally. And our main focus areas in the last few years have been transgender and other LGBT rights, Indigenous rights, and disability rights. We fought in the federal human rights tribunals and provincial human rights tribunal as advocates for complainants that turned to us when they had nowhere else to go or when no one else would help them. We've had a successful track record of bringing about change in Canadian prisons with the RCMP, with education organizations throughout Canada, and as well as a number of nonprofit and corporation entities that have brought us in to bring them advice or change. In 2020, I participated in writing a book called We Resist, Defending the Common Good in Hostile Times, edited by Cynthia Levine-Rasky and Lisa Kowalchuk. I should apologize. It's Kowalchuk, Lisa Kowalchuk, not Kowalchuk. I contributed a chapter to this book, and I'm going to be reading from it today. It's chapter 37, and it starts on page 301. Yet we rise, cultivating a resilient transgender community that overcomes systemic barriers, by Morgane Oger. I'm a trans rights activist and progressive Canadian politician working to increase equality and justice for all Canadians. I advocate mostly in the context of LGBTQ2+ rights, education policy, health policy, and housing security, with a focus on bringing down systemic barriers and addressing discrimination on the basis of gender identity or expression in Canada. This is the basis of the mission statement of the Morgane Oger Foundation. My trans activism normalizes the experiences of transgender and non-binary people in an effort to advocate for the frameworks and policies that protect us from discrimination, so trans people can live their lives to their fullest, free from discrimination. Another aspect of the activism relies on sharing Canada's example with other countries addressing bias in policy implementation. That trans folks thrive in Canada without any change in crime statistics or proof of harm demonstrates that proposed legislative changes in other countries that follow Canada's example will contribute to a better situation. One embodiment of my activism is that, and that of the foundation, is the act of resisting trans erasure and pathologization through the normalization of the perception of our lives. We demonstrate that trans people are everywhere, that being transgender is not in of itself a meaningful impediment to living one's life authentically in our society. We exist, we are here, and we have no patience left. The lay of the land. At the time of writing, xenophobic incidents have been growing steadily in the Americas for a number of years. Hate violence has been on the rise and in Canada since 2013. And in British Columbia, where I live, we observed a 30% increase of hate violence in 2016 and a 47% in 2017. An update to that is that number has continued to grow. A corresponding increase in severity of incidents has accompanied this increase of hate-induced violence. Canada's worst hate-based incidents since the 1989 gender-motivated mass murder at École Polytechnique de Montréal, during which 14 women were targeted and murdered, was the 29 January 2017 Quebec City mosque mass shooting at the Islamic Cultural Center of Quebec City. 6 worshippers were killed and 19 others injured by gunmen during evening prayer. At the time of writing, other incidents had not yet happened. Religious extremists and white supremacist groups are organizing in British Columbia, and there have been a growing number of hate-based anti-trans flyer distributions here. Excuse me. The Soldiers of Odin, a white supremacist organization with violent tendencies, currently patrols a number of British Columbian neighborhoods. an anti-LGBT conservative group known as Culture Guard, led by Carrie Simpson, has been combining homophobic and transphobic hate at rallies, which are now a regular occurrence in British Columbia. Culture Guard, the KKK, and Soldiers of Odin are organizing and fundraising openly. As we know, vulnerability to oppression stems in part from having insufficient power in a society and from an inability to find protection in the systems it puts at our disposal. When we are not protected by laws, policies, and attitudes, we are vulnerable, as reflected by hate crime data. This disconcerting rise in intolerance in Canada is the root cause that motivated the creation of the Morgane Oger Foundation to help combat supremacist bias through a policy change that narrows the gap between our laws and their application on the ground. Visibly take up space. Those who enter spaces that have not yet been opened up to transgender persons and demonstrate that transness is irrelevant help shift the bias that comes from a lack of familiarity. This is one of the way activists have been steadily eroding the existing system of oppression against our communities, because it is much harder to hate a friend you respect simply because they are trans. In order to increase awareness that our society's rules also need to allow for increasingly normalized realities of trans folks, trans activists work to show we exist with a knowledge that we need to be seen to be included. These change makers who are first in these closed spaces show by example that whenever stigma must be eroded is caused by bias and unfamiliarity rather than by underlying truths or pathology. They often demonstrate by example that there will be consequences for those who ignore the intentions and letter of the law as it pertains to letting us live our lives fully and equally. Awareness of diversity and inclusion is the first step to respecting the rules that protect diverse communities. Participate fully. The trans community needs to continue fighting to ensure our voices are present at decision-making time in all contexts that matter. As the expression nothing about us without us goes in documenting our lives, so does it apply to the workplace, policymaking, and governance. Trans folks need to see members of our community working in role model careers. Young transgender and non-binary persons need to see that we are not only being given space in cisgender society, but our voices shape society. We are equal participants and we are seeing signs of progress. In Canada, as of the winter of 2019, there is finally one out elected transgender person, Julie Lemieux, mayor in Très Saint-Rédempteur, Quebec. Canada came close to having an out transgender lawmaker elected, me, in 2017, but that goal remains frustratingly elusive. So far in Canada, all laws that affect trans and non-binary people have been enacted by legislative bodies that excluded us and failed to sufficiently consult with us. Since this was written, a number of transgender and two-spirit persons have been elected to Canadian lawmaking and governance bodies, including the Canadian Parliament and the Squamish Nation Council. There is one transgender judge in Manitoba and a handful of lawyers sprinkled throughout the nation. We're even seeing handfuls of doctors and nurses. At the University of Victoria, there is one transgender person who is the only chair of transgender studies in Canada, the only transgender studies program in Canada to my knowledge, but I could be wrong. There are a few transgender or gender diverse professors in Canadian universities studying trans experiences, but far less than that 0.5% of the Canadian population that's trans. If we look at the statistics, trans people are profoundly underrepresented to this day. We see more and more transgender people holding on to jobs and careers through their transition. We're even seeing trans students graduate and find employment, often in their field of study. Of course, trans professionals describe a significant disadvantage with employment due to bias or due to its consequences. We still have some way off, we are still some way off in time when being trans, I'm going to start that again. We're still some way off from a time when being trans is without consequences in someone's career. It is still tantalizingly over the horizon to live equally in Canada. But we're getting closer, so hang in there and keep on fighting. Those working folks are doing something for all of us by existing as role models and living out their daily lives. Their reality calls into question the all too prevalent narrative that transgender folks are inherently broken persons requiring either sympathy or charity. And if you'll notice, the rallying cry, funny I said crime, behind anti-trans lawmaking in Eastern Africa and in the United States has been the assumption that transgender people are inherently broken or predators or lying, which are the foundations of hate speech. Working on one's career is still an act of defiance for too many trans or non-binary folks. After all, far too many companies will resist putting a transgender or non-binary person in front of their clients. The trans folk among us who are breaking through stigma and the barriers it puts in our way are making inroads in our cis-normative culture to take hold of positions of power and privilege. This is easier in some countries and harder in others. We still have to be louder and pushier than cisgender people and are usually still the only ones of our kind that we know of at any job. There are very few trans people working in a business today that have another trans person there working with them unless they hired that person or their company is very, very large indeed, or based in Canada or the United States. Yet we can now show a growing roster of role models and enjoy our newly minted explicit protection from discrimination in Canada. Sadly, that success in establishing our rights in recent years is causing growing pushback from those who oppose our equality and still see us as an abomination or damaged goods or someone that needs to protect others from. The laws must protect us on paper, but attitudes on the grounds have some distance to catch up before we can truthfully claim to have reached equality in Canada or anywhere else that I know of. Brace yourself for the pushback. Again, this book was published in 2020 and written in 2019. When looming legislation was promising to finally ensure equality for trans persons in Canada in 2015, socially conservative organizers began to realize that the age-old bathroom predator trope had been exhausted after years of fruitful seeding of moral panic. I'm speaking about Canada here. Moral panic using bathroom tropes is still widely used. So is the school grooming panic. So is the transing our children panic. So is the sexual predator panic. So are all of the other panics. As a result, opponents focused on new targets. A handful of academics, now at the time, led by University of Toronto professor Jordan Peterson, who to my knowledge has never taught again since doing this, fomented opposition to trans rights on the basis of still new to many, the singular they. The pronoun used to describe non-binary people, they, singular they, as in look at them over there. They have an orange jacket, which we've been using for hundreds of years in the English language, and is prevalent in Shakespeare. That impossible to use singular they, that's the one we're talking about. Opponents brought out ill-conceived yet compelling free speech arguments in their pushback on Bill C-16, a bill that amended the Canadian Human Rights Act to add gender identity and gender expression to the list of prohibited grounds of discrimination. Well, actually, it added gender identity or expression, blurring the two together so that it recognizes identity and expression are indistinguishable, and that nobody or people rarely get attacked on their identity, which is very hard to document, but they get attacked on their expression of who they are. Reinvigorated since the 2016 US presidential election, when what's-his-name got elected, alt-right and supremacist movements joined in arguing that transgender equality law tramples on free speech and criminalizes freedom of expression. That's absolute bullshit, by the way. This refrain continues today with an intensity that seems to be amplified by the fact it applies to the needs of transgender people. Again, this is 2022. But in 2020, that was the big push. Meanwhile, the religious right is reeling at the policy and procedural consequences of equality protections of trans people in society, including in schools and social spaces. Conservative Christianity, in particular, is fermenting a growing pushback, claiming that helping trans kids is, quote, child abuse, unquote, famously stated in a public Facebook post by Chilliwack School District trustee Bear Neufeld in 2017. This is the pushback that we're seeing since 2020, going into 2022. And for a play-by-play on that, I recommend you follow Aaron Reed or Aaron in the Morning on Twitter or other social media. Aaron runs a newsletter on that documents the month-by-month, blow-by-blow efforts to demonize, pathologize, and vilify trans people in US states at the state level in order to create a hate movement that a number of analysts have attributed to being caused by the fall of Roe versus Wade, where social conservatives in the US have lost their rallying cry, so are manufacturing a new one regardless of facts. Who needs facts? Take control of the narrative and overcome the pushback. When we are working to convince people to change policy, there is a need to engage in debate over the validity of our claims. In order for this to work, it is necessary for our narrative to be told and heard as effectively and as widely as the opposite side's ideas, or preferably more so even. In a situation like trans rights advocacy, we're working asymmetrically to change the status quo. The new idea that we're promoting is a significant significant disadvantage. To succeed in winning hearts and minds, trans rights activists need to displace the existing narrative and replace it with our own. We have to get past bias, which is really hard, especially when the opposing side is so organized and will stoop to the lowest levels and the worst lies to push their point, because they're so shocking. Telling lies that are shocking is as effective as telling the truth. Ask the Nazis, that's how they did it. To get laws or major policies changed, we need to be supported by more than just the community seeking the change. This is a fundamental of politics. In British Columbia, in order for the trans community to win equal protection from discrimination in 2016 from government that was disinclined to provide it at the time, activists had to demonstrate wide geographic and demographical support throughout the province, and actually federally as well, so across the country. A similar tactic was used federally, leading to the 2017 passing of Bill C-16, the trans rights bill in the Canadian Parliament. We did this in part with a petition campaigning. It was a petition campaign which allowed us to geocode thousands of supporters from across British Columbia. Going further, we also reached out into religious congregations, civic organizations, labor, and private businesses, and convinced them to write the government in support of our campaign. Using these tools, we successfully showed that support was widespread and came from many communities. It helped a lot when we convinced evangelical Christian congregations to support us, breaking down the then BC Liberal government's perception, seated by the culture guard and their ilk, that faith communities were against transgender protection and faith communities were a kingpin in getting them elected. Once we have a majority of voices in support of an idea, we have to overcome those who are fanatically opposed to our views. Fanatically opposed to our views. In other words, opposition that's not based on fact or logic or reason, but based on fear and bias. I have to find my place. They are few in number, but their reach and determination are disproportionate. So we've really seen this in the last 3 or 4 years with social media, where we've seen that social media amplifies polarizing voices and therefore makes it easier for fringe elements to mainstream their views. This is a real problem that governments are aware of, and work that's being done to address this is really struggling. In Canada, there's some efforts to bring in federal laws to rein in misbehavior online, but this gets awfully close to censorship laws, scares a lot of people. In the case of transgender rights, the fanatic opposition is made up of 2 highly distinct communities: trans-exclusive radical feminists, who call themselves TERFs, adhere to an essential TERFs adhere to an essentialist perspective that centers the patriarchal oppression against women entirely on female bodies rather than women as a gender. So they reject gender and they believe in sex-based discrimination, which there's some fact to that, and they exclude trans women exclusively, and they consider trans men to be women on the basis of sex, physiological and biological function, basically. Of course, presumed function, which is what gender is, but we won't go there. The TERFs frame their ideas using essentialist terminology like reproductive rights and issues related to patriarchal control of female bodies, and questions about body autonomy, which is the basis of feminist organizing dating back to the previous generation. So second wave feminism, which was the feminism of my mother's era, that was all about bodies, autonomy. They fought for autonomy. And that was a righteous fight, obviously. But that's not the fight today for many of us. We're past autonomy now. But then again, you could say that the US is really pushing back on that. If only not having common interest in everything didn't cause some of us in society to attack others in society on the things where we do have common purpose. If only people were better. Sadly, not everybody is as good as they could be. The second group is a socially conservative right, most notably North American evangelical Christians and conservative Catholics, evangelical Catholics as well, who view transgender bodies as either abominations against their belief system or a sign of debauchery. I think it's fair to say that conservative Muslims fall under this as well, and so do some branches of conservative Judaism. These unlikely allies strongly oppose any increase in transgender inclusion and tend to be well-funded and organized. You know, when you've got leading feminist organizations and the dominant monotheistic church groups in the world claiming to speak for all women or everyone when they advocate against equality rights, you have a pretty powerful soup of opposition. That's why you have to break it down. Because they are well established, these organizations easily access media and public opinion through their networks. When working to reset the narrative to one that benefits our goals, the challenge lies in accessing the traditional and social media at a scale that benefits us to change their perception. So the perception of their members and the perception that they push, those two perceptions. Despite Trump's campaign to portray mainstream media as tainted and biased, which is basically the GOP campaign in the US, and in Canada, we have the campaigns of the People's Party of Canada, which didn't really exist effectively at the time of writing of this book, and some of the conservative, let's say, saber rattlers. You get a situation where a significant amount of political effort is going to discrediting their own watchdog, the press, whose purpose is to be the watchdog of politicians. It's kind of dangerous, actually, which is why it's so dangerous to be attacking the press when they're doing their job of telling everybody that there's a number of people out there who are doing awful things and that should be politically watched. There are still many, many people who get all of their news from the TV, the radio, or the websites of established outlets. And if those outlets stop applying journalistic standards or fail to apply journalistic standards, the Rebel, Fox News, for example, come to mind. There's lots of others. We've got the extremist sites as well, the issue-driven sites. If they only get their news from limited news sources, it's really hard to change their minds unless those sources reflect our views, which is important. When working to control the narrative, we need to be seen by the audience as being more reasonable, more evidence-based, and more sympathetic than those who oppose us. And I'll just add that you can be certain that the people on the other side of this argument are doing the exact same thing. They're trying to be more reasonable, more evidence-based, and more sympathetic to their audience than we are. And they're trying to put us in a bad light as well. Yet, even though we are trying to convince the public of our story, it is rarely the point of our campaigns. Our actual goal is to get our audience to act for us because we want the audience to push others, because we can't do it alone. It's a fantasy to think that a small number of people can get change done. You can only do that through the courts, really. To get things done at a large scale, you need the population on your side. There's no way around it. We have to tell them what to do, and therefore we're educating, but we're also aiming to have the largest possible effect through our audience. For example, to take control of the narrative and overcome pushback, we may want our audience to contact their decision makers or persuade their friends to do so. We may want money to fund advertising. We may want them to take some other specific actions. And to do that, they have to believe us. And we have to be credible. That's really important. To control the narrative, trans activists have to ensure we do it in a likable and approachable way. Sadly, the ones that are trying to control the narrative have to be compelling to the public that watches them. In political training, trainers tell us that you will win someone's heart and vote or contribution if they have a good experience with you. That's the main thing for politicians, to make sure the experience is positive. If you're having a negative experience with someone else, they'll never support you. All you can do is use them as an example. This is especially true if they see themselves as being very different from you, because you have to win their heart to see a similarity. This is important. Extreme. In the thick of resistance and opposition and in resisting oppression, that's invisible to most cis people. This is particularly important. I'll reread it because I hashed it out. In the thick of resisting an opposition that oppresses you in a way that's invisible to most cis people, being likable and, let's say, someone that you can associate to is particularly important. What it really says is don't just sing to the choir, right? In churchy terms, you have to talk to everyone. Otherwise, not talking to the opponents is going against your best interests. Now, mind you, you don't necessarily have to personally speak to them. Someone else could speak to them for you. We always have to manage the dosage of information for our audience and stay within their own perception of what is plausible and reasonable. If we start with transphobic homicide statistics and follow in with the success rates in courts for transgender people fighting for their lives, we seriously risk losing people who barely believe us at all. It's better to break bread, talk about our commonality, and so forth when you're trying to create a human link. There are places for those conversations, like awareness-raising events in universities or at the second or third meeting with allies, but initial contact or advocacy with the public needs nuanced statements that the audience can understand and digest, and that they empathize with. Managing these experiences must not be confused, however, with pandering to people who hate us. I'm not telling people to amplify hatred or to enable hatred. There are people who just do not believe you and do not want you alive. And those people, you don't owe them a meeting or an explanation. Nor should it mean sweeping major problems under the rug. Whereas much of the advocacy we are doing has forced the trans community to deal with people who openly hate us or consider us abominations, we are required to remain polite and engaging while staying firm and continuing to move forward towards our goal. Now, I'm going to pause here and say that we here as the people who are doing this advocacy work, there's also resistance work. There's also, consequence work, things like this. You don't have to be polite to the person that's being made an example of through the legal system. And I am not giving this advice to people who believe in direct action. People who believe in direct action, which I tend not to agree with, but you know how to do your thing, and I'm not telling you what to do. I don't agree with causing harm to people, but I'm also mindful that in resistance movements of the past, it's been sometimes necessary to use asymmetric tools. And sadly, in a number of resistance movements, the only way to get your opponents to the table has gone through violence. This is despicable and is a hard reality. But nevertheless, ignoring the past repeats it. When you're doing advocacy, though, in activism, we still need to tread lightly because the only way to people's hearts is by not calling them bigots too often. Even if it feels deeply satisfying to mention the elephant in the room, that person is openly discriminating against us or supporting a hateful idea, we still do better if we engage with them without insulting them, right? And, I've insulted lots of people. Sometimes you insult them, and sometimes you're strategic. That said, I personally give only so many chances, and some individuals have earned my utter contempt as human beings. Again, I would never advocate for violence. But if you're such a despicable person that you think that treading on other people's equality is somehow going to make you richer or more powerful or have a bigger piece of cake, then you are a despicable person, and I have no time for you if you refuse to see and understand how that makes you a bad person, because there are bad people out there. In other words, in conclusion, The fight for equal rights never ends. First, the fight must be won, which is the hardest part. And then the fights must be forever defended. By the fight, I mean the rights themselves. You have to win your rights, but rights that are not defended are lost. To keep safe the very rights that protect us, we must maintain our lore and cultivate our voices. We have to amplify our culture, make it seen, so people take it for granted that it's valid and meaningful. We must lift our role models and use them as examples to us all of our role models, the playwrights, the journalists, the homemakers, the priests, the politicians, the activists, the placemakers, the people who are the first responders, the people who make things better for all of us, the people who have broken ground. Amplify everybody contributing to society and make space for people to participate in society. We must encourage our future leaders to prepare for the oncoming work that we opened up for them to do. The work isn't done. In Canada, we got equality, we got explicit protection of gender identity or expression. If our opponents were to tear that down, they'd put all of the other explicit protections at risk. It's never going to happen. No one will allow it. But nevertheless, all kinds of people will try, and we have to make sure it never happens. We must encourage our future leaders to prepare for the coming work that we opened up for them, so they will protect us when we're too old to fight. Like, I'm going to be too old. I'm going to need someone else to step on my shoulders and the shoulders of the people who came before me. All of the activists are mindful about keeping the pipeline open, keeping on training new people. And to all of us who are activists ourselves, please dedicate some of your time to training up the future generation. Not everybody will work out, only a few probably, but it's good to see that happen, and it's good for us. We need continuity. They may not have the same ideas as us, but that's okay. We did our bit. Let them do their part, even if it doesn't match us. I remember the resistance I got from my elders about gender identity or expression, about gender-free ID, about birth certificates, about not requiring a psychiatrist to give you permission to be trans, about your passport. I got a lot of pushback. I remember people didn't all want it. But look at where we are now, and look how much better a society Canada is, thanks to those changes that we brought in together. The community is protected by its institutions and by public policy. Those have to be strong. We must build these up to ensure our needs are met and to help us see any coming storm before the trouble takes hold. We need our institutions to help us see the storm because they'll watch out for it. Institutions like EGAL, like the Morgane Oger Foundation, like LEAF, institutions that believe in equality, our human rights tribunals, our human rights commissions, very important bodies. We must know what to do if conflict looms, because the best way to withstand any future transphobic storm is to never allow it to build up to that point. I think here we can we can look at what's happening in the US right now, in the southern states, where lawmakers are actually passing hateful rules because it's not illegal for them to do it. We have the same going on in East Africa and Uganda right now as I speak. Kenya is on the brink. The ex-USSR countries are a problem. The Muslim world is a total shit show when it comes to trans rights, except for very few countries like Pakistan, maybe a few others. It's tough, right? And in Canada, we got these laws in, and now we can avoid the storm. And we want to help others detect the storms before they get to them. For our community to stay safe, we must be vigilant and ensure that the effort to erode our rights and protections fail. All of the efforts. We can't give up rights and protections. It's critical. Okay, so that was my chapter in We Resist, Defending the Common Good in Hostile Times. Whoa, right here up. This is the book. And I'm going to finish off by reading the spine. The 2016 United States presidential election exposed rising xenophobic and nationalist sentiment within the US and other democratic countries. I think we're all in agreement this is still happening. As populist movements grow, democratic freedoms erode. We Resist demonstrates that the things we often take for granted, safety, family, employment, health, a promising future, are under attack. This was written before Roe versus Wade failed, before trans rights were attacked so ardently in the United States and in East Africa. We must fight to preserve these resources before it's too late. We're currently witnessing the dismantlement of social programs, growing disinterest in international cooperation, and the devaluation of evidence-based knowledge. I think we all agree with that. This disturbing shift in politics is leading to increased national security measures, violations to basic human rights, and widening social and economic inequalities. The rise of far-right populism brings with it intolerance to ethnic, sexual, and all other minority groups, and a rejection of democratic society. We Resist gathers the compelling perspectives of scholars and activists that are deeply embedded within political and community struggles, who participate in policy decisions, and who are engaged in research that advances these struggles. An essential and timely book, We Resist confronts the problems we face as a human community and impels a cross-sectoral movement to defend our right and revitalize the common good. The meta of this book is that we're much stronger all working together towards the common good than just to working on our unique ideas in our own silos. And if we can pull our allies in our slipstream behind us when we're having success, the success we bring to them will help them bring success to us in our advocacy. All working together, we're going to be much stronger than all of our silos working against our own inequalities, working apart. Thank you very much for listening to me reading Yet We Rise from We Resist. If you'd like more information about the Morgane Oger Foundation, you can go to morganeoger.ca. And if you'd like to know more about me and my work, I recommend you just Google me, Morganeoger. Okay, thank you very much. And by the way, this video was recorded on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish nations. That in itself is a human rights issue that's long to be addressed and has not been fully addressed. And today is Trans Day of Visibility, and here I am being very, very visible. To everybody who can't be visible today because they're not safe, I see you, and hang in there. Like I say to many, many people, in the event of loss of cabin pressure or human rights, put the mask on yourself first before you put the mask on the person next to you. Keep yourself safe, thriving, and participating as you can, and that in of itself is a successful act of visibility and resistance. Thank you very much.